Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Dr. Anjali Demari, Associate Professor in the Department of English, Guwahati University. Today we are going to do the course Indian Writing in English. And the module that we will be doing is Kamala Das's My Story. Kamala Das Suraya, known popularly as Kamala Das, is renowned in the Indian literary scenario for her remarkable contribution to Indian writing in English as a poet. She was born on 31st March 1934 in Kerala's Malabar district. Now, perhaps you will be knowing that she is a bilingual writer and she wrote poems and short stories in her native language, Malayalam, most of which were published under her pen name Madhavi Kutty. From her childhood onwards, she had been exposed to a literary environment at her home as her great uncle, Nalapat Narayan Menon, was a poet and she was greatly influenced by him. In fact, her mother, Balamani Amma's poetic passion and the religious writings of the Nayars too were great sources of inspiration for her. Her father, V.M. Nair, worked as the managing editor of Malayalam daily Matrubhumi. The oeuvre of her writing in English includes the collection of short stories Padmavati the Harlot and Other Stories, which was published in 1992. Her poetry books include works like Summer in Calcutta, which was published in 1965, The Descendants, published in 1967, The Old Playhouse and Other Poems, 1973, The Annamalai Poems, published in 1985, and also Only the Soul Knows How to Sing, published in 1996. In fact, she has also written a novel, Alphabet of Last, which was published in 1977. She was also conferred with the Pen Poetry Prize and Sahitya Academy Award, and in the year 1984, she was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature. In 1973, Kamala Das wrote her autobiography, Ante Katha, in Malayalam, which was later published in English as My Story and published in 1976. It was first serially published in a weekly named Malayala Nadu. Das's desire to reveal her secrets constitute one of the important elements of an autobiography. Her autobiography, My Story, thus traces her childhood in Calcutta and Malabar, her marriage, as well as her literary journey. It also documents her personal experiences of being a woman, her quest for love, and most importantly, her assertion of self. In fact, this question of identity is very central in the works of Kamala Das, whether it is her poems or whether it is her autobiography. Let us situate Kamala Das's My Story in a milieu of women autobiographers. And for this, let us have a look now at the development of women's autobiography in India. So now we are going to trace the development of women's autobiography. We look at the autobiographies one by one. The first autobiography that we are going to discuss is by Bahini Bai. And her autobiography was published in 1700. And in fact, she was the first Indian woman who is said to have written the first autobiography. After that, let us now discuss the next autobiography, that is by Rasundari Devi, and she wrote the autobiography Amar Jibon, which was published in 1876. And she is said to be the first woman autobiography in Bengali. So far as Rasundari Devi is concerned, she was a very ordinary housewife, but she possessed an extraordinary zeal to read the holy books. And in fact, it was from her son's book that she had painstakingly learned the letters. Another autobiography that is mentionable is by Ramabai Ranade. She was born in 1862 and she lived till 1924. Her autobiography is written in Marathi, and the name of her autobiography is Amachya Ashyati Kahi Atwani, and in English it can be translated as Memoirs of a Life Together. Let us look into another autobiography, and that is by Binodini Das. She was born in 1863 and she died in 1924. She wrote Amar Katha, and that also in the Marathi language, and in English it is translated as My Story. In fact, all these women autobiographers, they hail from a very conservative, patriarchal background, and in fact we see that most of them almost always are marginalized. They remain in the periphery, and what is important is that they never enjoyed any space of their own. They were expected, as the expectations were, that they should be very good wives. And in their autobiographies, women like other women, in fact, like Lakshmi Bai Tilak, Ramabai Ranade, they also express their views on marginality in parental households where they were only made to sing, play, read, and in fact, writing was out of the question. Most of the memoirs that we have just mentioned are in fact these women's personal experiences as individuals. These early women autobiographers always concealed their sexual life. That was something considered very, very private. They were not allowed to speak or even talk about it, even amongst themselves or among the relatives and friends. There are no references, therefore, to things like menstruation, menopause, and sexual experiences in their autobiographies. Their autobiographies also reflect the turmoil and disagreements overshadowing their expectation of liberal society, attaining freedom from their situation of being colonized. In fact, their life stories also throw light on the ways through which they overcome the obstacles of life, making a space of their own. In fact, it was always an effort on the part of these autobiographers to have a voice of their own, to create an identity, a space of their own, to come out of the marginalized and the peripheral spaces in which they were limited to. In fact, in the 19th century, the common themes of women's memoirs are, for example, the happiness and satisfaction which they derive from their husband's progress, along with their own education and the prospect of a renewed life for themselves. In a word, we can say that whatever they achieved was only through the lenses or parameters of their husbands. The later group of women autobiographers is marked for their assertion of right to create new identity models for women to meet the challenges of the changed times. So in a way, we can say that the later autobiographers, they made an effort to in a sense, to maybe draw some new lines or to come out from the old models which were before them. So the autobiographies of Binodini Dasi and Cornelia Sorupti bear testimony to the mentioned fact. Binodini Dasi is a legendary figure in Bengali theatre. Her autobiography is a major document of the Bengali theatre and the earliest first-person records of a woman who remained single and worked for a living. In that sense, her autobiography definitely is of significance when we study women autobiographies. She was victimized and used by the male-dominated society while trying to restore the theatre that she was working in. Okay, let's come to another woman autobiography, that is Cornelia Sorupti. She was born in 1866 and she lived till 1954. In fact, she was the first woman to have graduated. She was not given the scholarship which she obtained from Government of India after she acquired the first place in Bombay Presidency College, which obviously was a unique achievement by her. She had to wait for 30 long years to qualify as a practicing lawyer after she received her degree of Bachelor in Laws. That shows, waiting for 30 long years. Perhaps that cannot be said, of men for that matter. Let's come to another group of women autobiographers. Perhaps in this list we can look at autobiographers like Brinda, Urmila Haksar and Sharanjit Shan, who record their trauma of being women. But one thing that we notice in these autobiographers is that they cultivated the conviction that women can be liberated only when she is economically independent. So we see here that economic independence for women becomes very, very important. And of course, apart from economic independence, what is also important for women at the same time is education and of course to have a career of their own. These autobiographers, they seek to fulfill their domestic roles apart from the other roles perhaps that they have to essay so far as their lives are concerned. They were achievers by nature who would not remain satisfied only with their men's success. So in a sense, all these autobiographers, they try to essay a role for themselves. They try to create a space of their own in the limited space that was given to them, by their men or by the males, we can say. They had to excel in their own pursuits individually to satisfy their craving for self-fulfillment. The autobiographies of Durgabai Deshmukh, Dhanvanti Rana Rao, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay had the highest honor of being awarded the Padma Bhushan for their successful public life. And we should say that this is no mean achievement for these women autobiographers to have actually won the highest award, the Padma Bhushan. What they do in their works, in their autobiographies, is that they challenge the myth that woman is made only to be confined in the four walls of their home. The contribution of Kamala Das's memoir to women's autobiography in general and specifically to Indian women autobiography is by far very, very significant. While narrating her life in her autobiography, she has crossed the gender boundaries of what is generally considered to be correct for a woman. The autobiography reflects the life of an artist who seems to be compassionate about the possible protest of Indian women as extremely exploited agent in the social and domestic circumstances. In fact, her writing, whether it is her poetry, we see that there is always evident a note of protest. And this note of protest is amply evident even in her autobiography. So her protest is directed against the injustices and the persecution to which women in India have always been subjected to. And this is not a new thing. Women have always been subjected to, they continue to be subjected to. And therefore we have still works where women writers, they continue to write about women's protest against the system, against the patriarchal system which is still existent even today. So when we coming back to Kamala Das's My Story, we see that she registers a strong protest against victimization. In fact, she became prominent for being exceptionally vocal about her most private experiences. In fact, she is known for her frankness. She stands out because of her frankness. She was the first woman who actually brought the frankness into writing, for that matter. In fact, maybe her writing is also influenced by the fact that she grew up in the Nalapat house, and in that Nalapat house, the strong character was her grandmother. In fact, she has a poem which is called Grandmother's House. And of course, her grandmother was the important influence in her life. And of course, in that Nalapat house, she grew up among a host of other relatives. And hers was a very close family, and they had connection with a number of British families. But Kamala Das's experiences in school with the British and Anglo-Indian classmates was not exactly so good. She, in fact, was called as a blackie by the other students, and who would want to be called a blackie? So we see that she was, as she says in her autobiography, that she was called a blackie. Though her parents never expressed disappointment over their children's color, but her father made them drink a monthly purgative and insisted her grandmother to apply turmeric and oil on Das's skin. This is quite interesting, because though the parents did not believe, in color and all that, but we see that perhaps that was present in the culture. And maybe somewhere people did want the children to have a fair complexion. So that tells why maybe the father wanted the grandmother to make her to apply turmeric on Kamala Das's skin. So we see that all these things impacted the mind of Kamala Das from a very, very young age. So she was conscious of the reality that her parents were awfully incompatible. Her father never articulated any word of appreciation to his children, which affected her as well as her siblings too, because basically we see that children want some good words from their parents, because that happens to be a source of encouragement, and they grow with that sense of confidence. But that we find missing in Kamala Das's life, as well as her siblings. So from a very early age, we see that she suffered from a sense of alienation, not only at school but also at home. The life she led all throughout might also have been affected by her myriad childhood experiences. On reading her autobiography, her life story, therefore, it becomes quite explicit that she had never been a tradition-bound woman. She seems to be a very independent woman who always wanted to come out of those patriarchal structures, or we can say traditional structures, and she wouldn't want to conform to the social norms. So we can say that she epitomizes a modern Indian woman who is extremely vocal about her feelings and experiences. And that is the reason why maybe she brings her life into writing, through her poems or through her autobiography. She, through her courage and confidence, asserts her identity as an individual. When Kamala Das's autobiography, My Story, was published, it shocked mainstream Kerala for the descriptions of her encounters with men and her most intense personal experiences. In 1976, when My Story was published, perhaps Kerala was not open to the kind of writing that she was doing. Her frankness was something which was not welcome, which was not acceptable. But nevertheless, she was brave enough to write this autobiography. She talks about her upbringing by careless parents, her marriage to an egoistic and indifferent person, her disappointments in love, and her illicit love affairs with other men in order to remove her boredom and anxiety. So obviously questions of illicit love something definitely will not be acceptable, to a very traditional society, but she experienced those in her life and she wanted to make them public. Her marriage proved to be an absolute failure because her husband treated her merely as a means of providing sexual gratification while giving her no love and affection. At a point of time when all of Kamala Das's hopes and desires of a loving and caring husband shattered, she even thought of a divorce when she could not initiate. In fact, there's reference to this in her very famous poem and introduction. Her straying thus becomes an escape for her from the unfulfilled desires of being loved. The hostile attitude of her husband towards her prompts her to search for love and companionship outside marriage. And in fact, if you're familiar with her poetry, you will see that that becomes a subject in many of the poems that she has written. Poem after poem, that becomes a subject of her poem. She is a woman who is in search of love, in search of an identity. It's only because her husband, she could not find that love in her husband. She also talks about the lack of sexual fulfillment for Indian women trapped in rushed arranged marriages. So we see, while she's talking of herself in her poems, she is also, in a sense, talking about the case of other Indian women, who are closeted, within the four walls of their home, who are closeted in the private spaces, who do not come out. And so maybe when she was writing the poems, she wanted her women audience, in a sense, to identify with what she was writing. She illustrates, in fact, her own wedding night as rape, which shows that Kamala Das brings forth her experiences of womanhood, which the other Indian women do not discuss in reverence to social norms. So in a sense, we see that she was giving a space, she is giving a voice to other women, so that, by reading her poems, they can understand their own situations. So we find that she constantly refuses to remain silent and discusses her feelings of longing and loss at length in her works. So my story is a work which throws light on the orthodoxy of traditional Nair families. The Nair society is basically matrilineal, and the members own property jointly, including brothers and sisters. Now, history says that Nair women were autonomous, self-reliant, and enjoyed greater personal freedom than women in the rest of India. But the question arises whether Nair women are endowed with the liberty that they are supposed to possess. It's not enough to say that they are autonomous, that theirs is a matrilineal family, but how much empowered are the women in that community, in that society? In fact, she witnesses many incidents of the Nair society which reflects its true nature. For instance, in a typical Nair society, women wear heavy jewelry to show off the wealth of their husbands. Kamala Das, in this regard, mentions, and I quote her, "My grandfather liked to see women glamorized with jewels, flowers," unquote. While talking about her father, she says that he imposed his Gandhian ideals over her mother. In the same context, she talks about Madhavi Amma, her granduncle's daughter, who lived a very secluded life. Earlier, she was married to a scholar with whom she was very, very happy. But her husband had to walk out of her life as he fell out of favor with her uncle. Kamala Das comments, and I quote, "The Nayars, particularly the males, were coarse when their ire was aroused," unquote. So it shows how a woman's happiness is overlooked just to feed fat a man's ego. But Kamala Das credits her awareness to be the product of her exposure to life. Her autobiography is a loud protest of a married woman suppressed in a male-dominated society. It is not only her protest, she makes it a protest of the women as a whole. It illustrates that in a world dominated by man, she tries to assert her individuality to maintain her feminine identity. From this revolt rose all her troubles, psychological trauma, and frustration. In her own way, she comes out with a forceful resistance to gender constraints. We see that her autobiography, My Story, gives important insights into the mind of an artist as well as the body of woman affronting the structures of a deeply patriarchal society. For her, it seems writing becomes a way to vent out to the trauma of a very unhappy marriage. Like Kamala Das, all who grew up in the dual worlds of tradition and modernity increasingly found themselves vulnerable and unprepared to face the world which is still controlled, obviously, by patriarchal values. The description of homosexuality which we find in her autobiography would infuriate the conservative Indian readers. Through her writing, in fact, she chose to convey her very inner feelings. Looking into some of her poems, her intention becomes more explicit, as I have said earlier as well, that many of the things that we find in her autobiography are we can read in her poems as well. So if we read The Freaks, her poem Freaks, which comes in her collection Summer in Calcutta, published in 1965, we see Kamala Das's resistance to social norms is projected where the persona declares that she is free. In another of her poems, A Relationship, and in several other poems, we see that she brings to the fore her boldness and her freedom in speaking aloud the secret longings and aspirations of womankind. The Indian social norms and conventions, as we know, are so strong and deep-rooted in the psyche of woman that she hardly dares to be as vocal about her private and personal feelings and experiences as Kamala does. Perhaps there will be very few writers who can be as frank and as outright as Kamala does even today. In fact, she was affected by the criticism she had to face, as she mentions that she indulged herself in drinking too to retain her mental stability. And of course, drinking for women is a taboo. So Kamala Das writing about her drinking definitely is something which will not be acceptable. Kamala Das is a woman of rare courage and strong conviction. She takes pride of being a woman. She celebrates her sexuality, her womanhood, and importantly, her body. But we also find a strong sense of social concern which gets reflected in her description of Indian society in My Story as well as in her other writings. She in fact articulates the misery of a woman writer who does not have the financial support to sustain her creative endeavor. At times, she would become frustrated as her domestic responsibility came in her way of writing, which she has mentioned in her narrative. Her bouts of illness as well as of her children also left her devastated many a times. And therefore we see that all this, in a sense, was an obstacle in her writing. But she did emerge as a woman who could direct all her experiences, good and bad, towards productivity. And therefore she has a huge body of work. She continued to write in spite of the adverse circumstances. In this way, she paved the way for later women writers to be vocal about their feelings and experiences and break the stereotypical image of an Indian woman. So for her, writing was a passion with which she thought magic could be created. I hope now you have a better understanding of Kamala Das's autobiography. Not only Kamala Das's autobiography, My Story, but I suppose you also have an understanding of other women autobiographers in India from the early times. Thank you.